Okay, so for those who were here before, thank you once again. For those who joined us, welcome. And thank you also to everybody who's listening in online. I'm very grateful to All Souls College and in particular David Gellner for this invitation. What I present here is ongoing research, and that's based on extended interviews and participant observation. This is work in progress, and I welcome your comments, your questions, and your criticism. We live in the Anthropocene, a new geological epoch in which human actions have profoundly changed the Earth, its ecosystems, and its climate. Much of this change in climate is caused by global warming, as greenhouse gases from burning coal, oil, petroleum, and natural gas accumulate in the atmosphere and trap heat. Warmer air, oceans, and lands together create longer and hotter heat waves, more frequent droughts and wildfires, heavier rainfall, and more powerful storms. These severe forces of nature, of weather, the elements, heat, wind, cold, rain, have always been with us. But much more than mere weather, the term the elements suggests agency and power, extreme forces that must be endured. And it is that agency, as it works with and against humans, other living beings and non-living elements, that is the subject of these lectures. I shall explore only a very thin slice of this topic, and that is urban North India, especially the metropolis of Delhi, where I live and work. Each place is particular, and these great global forces may affect them all, but in ways that are distinctively local and conjunctural, tangled in specific histories and geographies. So I do not attempt to generalize, but I do hope that you may find evidence and arguments that resonate with other places and peoples. Another caveat, this is also a topic that cries out for urgent public action. We need much more investigation and analysis and mobilization, especially on the ground amongst the most vulnerable social groups, research that speaks truth to power. Of course we do. But in these lectures, I shall set aside the question of what is to be done and instead focus on what was, what is, and how people make sense of it. In my previous lecture, I described how the cultural experience of heat has changed across society as global warming has interacted with Delhi's pollution, patterns of work and housing and travel, and with cooling technologies. I argued that these dynamic factors and forces are codependent, entangled in ways that are hard to unravel. They create new lifestyles and also new habits of body and mind. They also create new inequalities and vulnerabilities, feeding vicious circles of deepening exploitation and ecological distress, leading to the catastrophic violence of heat waves. As counterpoint, I touched on older, still practiced modes of thinking and living with heat, which conceive a more harmonious relationship between the body and its environment, each interconnected with the other, where people submit to the rules of the season, a mode of engagement with nature that contrasts with the totalizing sequestration offered by air conditioning. Some of these themes and arguments also inform my lecture today on dust, another everyday element of life in Delhi that has been rendered strange by the same forces that have led to climate change. Where does dust come from? What does it do? How do people deal with it? Dealing with dust is a daily, mundane chore in Delhi. Inside our homes, we sweep and we swab. This is called doing jhadu pocha each morning. When I'm listening to a lecture or a discussion on Zoom on my headphones, or when I'm talking on the phone, I wander around my flat with a damp cloth, wiping down bookshelves and tabletops, walking to the sink, to rinse and repeat. When I went to study in the US in upstate New York, I was so surprised. One didn't need to sweep and mop and dust for days at a time. There was no dust. Dust finds its way into my Delhi flat, no matter whether the doors are open or closed. There's more of it in summer, especially after the short, sharp andhis or dust storms that occasionally punctuate the oppressive heat. Some of this dust has come across the sea, all the way from the Arabian Peninsula. This dust is made up of particles of mineral matter about 10 microns in diameter. This dust is a nuisance, but a minor one. Far, far worse is the dust that I cannot see, that I breathe deep into my lungs, that is slowly making me sick, and that will shorten my life. And that dust is the gift of the Anthropocene. Dust is born on the air. While air itself is a compound of different gases, it's also a busy medium for many things. It carries sounds to our ears and signals to our mobile phones. Air carries smells by bringing molecules of volatile organic chemicals to our noses. Besides dust, air also carries water and pollen and viruses, a minestrone soup of organic and inorganic substances, dead and living matter, all bobbing along on the current. And dust itself, or airborne particulate matter, what's called PM, is not a single thing. Dust is a complex mixture of many chemicals, and this mix can contain aerosols composed of small droplets of liquid, or dry solid fragments, or solid cores with liquid coatings. Particles vary in size and shape and chemical composition. They may contain inorganic ions, metallic compounds, elemental carbon, organic compounds, and compounds from the Earth's crust. Life in this aerosol soup is unstable because gases can form particles. Sunlight and humidity can change the properties of these particles. Other things can modify their form and function. I'd like you to note this ever-changing character of airborne particulate matter. The idea of airborne particulate matter as a pollutant, as a civic problem needing public action, emerged in Delhi only in the early 1990s. I've written in some detail about this earlier, so I'm only going to sketch the broad contours of my previous analysis here. In the 1990s, a common sense narrative about the problem of air pollution came to be crafted by the judiciary, the media, and an assertive upper class. Air and water were polluted by industries, and all these industries were big and small, were either shut down on the orders of the courts, or they were ordered to relocate outside Delhi, where presumably they could continue to pollute as before. This hegemonic understanding of pollution as caused by industrial sources was not altogether wrong, but it was exceedingly partial. That is, it was selective in who it chose to blame, and it was biased in what it turned a blind eye towards. Even though 64% of Delhi's air pollution in 1993-94 came from motor vehicles, and only 12% came from industrial sources, the courts chose to focus on closing down factories. In response to litigation filed by an environmental activist lawyer, the Supreme Court of India issued a series of directions in the latter half of the 1990s that resulted in the closure of thousands of industrial units across Delhi. The petitions and the court's actions were justified as being in the public interest. The media and middle-class citizens widely supported this initiative. Affected factory owners and workers' organizations were not allowed to be heard by the courts, nor could they get the court to amend its decision. As a result, not only did many small factory owners suffer significant financial losses, thousands of poor workers and their dependents lost their only means of livelihood. Pollution from motor vehicles, the much higher source of pollution at that time, only came to the court's attention about 4 years after the court had targeted factories. Thanks to popular campaigns by NGOs such as the Center for Science and Environment in 1996. But then too, the court addressed the problem selectively. Privately owned vehicles, cars and motorcycles were exempted from action. The court's chief focus was on cutting emissions from public transport vehicles. The consequent shrinkage of public transport adversely affected taxi and auto rickshaw owners and working class commuters, while affluent consumers went unscathed. The number of private vehicles continued to rise unchecked. This pursuit of the so-called public interest deprived a large section of Delhi's working class of their means of subsistence. Presumed environmental benefits, cleaner air and water, were obtained at the cost of losing working environments, resources that provided livelihoods to some of the most vulnerable citizens of Delhi. How did elites succeed in presenting environmental hazard and spatial order as concerns that superseded the welfare of the working class? How did the priorities of workers, jobs, food, and shelter come to be overlooked? Why were affected workers not represented in the decision-making process? Why was action rooted through a judicial authority when the Indian government has an extensive administrative setup for monitoring and regulating pollution? Was the closure of factories the most effective way of improving air quality? All of these issues indicate that in the larger climate of economic liberalization that I described in my last lecture, environmental initiatives came to be detached from the principle of social justice. At the same time, environmental action moved away from the ground level collective mobilization of the social movements that India has been well known for, and instead leaped directly into the lofty precincts of India's high courts and Supreme Court. And for those who don't read Hindi, the placard that this boy is holding at a protest by workers says, "Motor gaadi ameer chalate, pradushan ke naam pe mazdoor ko bhagate." That it's the rich who run motor cars, but in the name of pollution, they chase away workers. The context in which the courts acted against air pollution was that of economic liberalization. This is the Indian Supreme Court. As the real estate market opened up to private developers, the land on which larger factories stood became more valuable than ever before. Global and national restructuring also influenced a shift in Delhi's production economy from manufacturing to services and commerce. This process eroded an industrial economy that, like construction, services, and commerce in the city, relied heavily on so-called informal labor, ill-paid workers with no job security who lived in illegal shanty settlements in the city, who were often migrants, and who were denied recognition as legitimate urban citizens. Connecting these processes, practices, and positions enables an understanding of how a so-called public interest around the problem of air pollution was created, such that working class interests and aspirations were left out. It is this convergence and the exclusions that it created that I call bourgeois environmentalism, elite interests disguised as public interests, supported by the media and the courts, and environmentalism that has little to do with ecological sustainability and social justice, and more with creating social and spatial order. So this narrative that was created, the problem of air pollution in Delhi, conjured up a cause and a constituency, authorized action and enabled exclusions, and obscured as much as it revealed. Air pollution as a set of objectively verifiable chemical changes in the air have been evident in Delhi for some time. However, they only came to be recognized as a problem and one that required public action at a particular conjuncture in the economic and political life of the city. What I mean to say is that there was no natural movement from the phenomenon of worsening air quality to the growth of collective concern. If there had been such a straightforward link between air pollution and public action, we would not be at the pass we find ourselves in today, where despite Delhi being the world's most polluted capital, there is no commensurate sense of urgency or resolve to tackle the issue. Jump forward 20 years into the present. The problem of air pollution has been relentlessly on the rise, and the city is firmly established as the most polluted capital city in the world. On Delhi's Air Quality Index, which is a composite of the incidence of different gases and particles, a score of 100 or below is called satisfactory. Note, however, that the AQI, Air Quality Index in India, has lower values for what is considered clean air compared to, say, the United States, or what the WHO, World Health Organization, puts out as categories to be aware of and take action, preemptive action against. Before the pandemic and the lockdown, which resulted in a slowdown for some periods, a shutting up of factories, travel was suspended. Before the pandemic and the lockdown, Delhi had no good air days in 2018. Not a single day in the year when AQI fell below 50. And there were only 54 days of satisfactory air when AQI was between 51 to 100. In the month of October, when people celebrate the Hindu festival of Diwali by bursting crackers, despite court-ordered bans, the AQI goes above 999, literally off the charts, because you just have three little squares where the numbers appear, and you don't even know what the AQI is. It's just 999. The air is murky, laced with charred smell. A world away from the skies, I remember, from September, October in the 1980s, when the monsoons would wash away all the suspended dust, leaving behind a beautiful deep blue firmament. October is now the season when the media and the government stage a by now familiar blame game. Air pollution, they say, is caused not in Delhi, but in the surrounding countryside, where farmers set fire to the stubble in their fields. Smoke from their smoldering fields drifts into Delhi, creating the gas chamber effect that lasts for 2 to 3 weeks. Let me take a couple of minutes to discuss this phenomenon of stubble burning, since it has a bearing on the urban-rural relations that I shall discuss in more detail in my last lecture on the rains. So the practice of farmers in Northwest India, in Punjab, in Haryana, in Western UP, of burning the residue of the paddy crop is relatively new, and it's been adopted since combine harvesters were introduced to speedily cut the paddy, that's the rice crop, so that farmers could sow the winter crop or wheat in time. Mechanical harvesting from combine harvesters leaves a taller residue than the more time-consuming hand scything. And this stubble, because it's taller, is harder to plow in and is therefore burnt. The reason for the rush in burning this stubble is that farmers have been banned from planting paddy early in the summer because irrigating the water-intensive paddy crop drains the groundwater. So compelled to plant paddy because of government rules, only when the monsoon rains start, farmers find that because they planted it later, it's harvested later, and the paddy crop cycle therefore eats into the time allotted for the winter wheat crop. So we're talking about how the water regime and the seasonal regime of temperature and moisture are now getting squeezed for farmers. And so farmers are in a rush to harvest the rice as quickly as possible so that they can then plant winter wheat. So this policy, which is aimed at curbing one ecological harm, namely water scarcity, because farmers are pumping out water to irrigate their young paddy crop, has now led to another, which is severe air pollution. There are various mechanical measures being tried out to change harvesting practices, but there's not enough thought or action about getting farmers to give up the water and chemical intensive paddy, wheat, paddy cycle into which the Green Revolution has locked them. Planting legumes and millets, monsoon season crops that used to be grown before the advent of the Green Revolution, is known to be more sustainable. But in the absence of support prices, why would farmers grow these older crops? So the wheat and rice which farmers are compelled to grow by the regime of state supports makes its way to cities, part of the subsidized cereal rations provided under the public distribution program. So cheap food, depleted soils and water, and dirty air are all entangled in this mess. And of course, the people who suffer the most from the dirty air are not just the people of Delhi, but the worst affected are those farmers and laborers who inhale the smoke directly. It's easier to agree on the causes of these episodic spikes in October, Diwali, stubble burning, when Delhi's characteristic climate conditions of air temperature inversion and low wind speed are conducive to the smog that this particular phenomena create. But what about the rest of the year? What about all those other days when air quality is poor, very poor, severe, and off the charts? What causes these? As a climate scientist explained to me, most studies of air pollution are snapshots. They don't capture the fluctuations in particular seasons and locations. And without data on what is called real-time source apportionment, different agencies and interest groups will continue to deny that they are responsible. So the best studies and models come up with widely divergent findings because they use different assumptions, different methods, different instruments. And the difficulties and disagreements stem in large part from the protean quality of aerosols, the elusive, shape-shifting nature of the particles themselves, their fast-fading signatures that are so hard to capture. What gases and particulate matter does a wood-burning cook stove release? How is the exhaust from a petrol engine on a motorcycle different from what comes out of the tailpipe of a diesel truck? What exactly is emitted from the chimneys of a thermal power plant? To complicate matters, PM, particulate matter, may be either directly emitted from these sources, what are called primary particles, or it may be formed in the atmosphere through chemical reactions of gases, what are called secondary particles, such as sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and certain organic compounds. Measuring and attributing is so tricky that it has only enabled an endless twiddling of thumbs. We don't know, so we can't do anything. The principle of fairness, that responsibility must be fixed accurately, that the correctly identified polluter must pay, overrides any other notion of fairness, one that would insist that if people are falling sick and dying, surely sweeping measures should be taken to curb pollution. But no, we're caught in this debate of assigning precise blame, again, double standards at work, whose fairness for whom and at whose cost. The same kind of deliberate dithering marks any discussion of how air pollution affects people's health. The particles of particular concern are called PM 2.5 because their diameter is smaller than 2.5 microns. They are mainly produced by burning fossil fuels and wood. They are a subset of PM10. PM10 refers to particles less than 10 microns in size. So PM 2.5 are a subset of very fine particulate matter within that. And PM10 includes wind-blown dust from open lands, dust from construction sites and landfills, wildfires and waste burning, pollen and fragments of bacteria. Both PM 2.5 and PM10 can be inhaled. And because of its tiny size, PM 2.5 is more likely to travel into and settle deeper inside the lungs, while PM10 is more likely to deposit on the surfaces of the larger airways of the upper regions of the lungs. Both sets of particles can induce tissue damage and lung inflammation. Research points to older adults with chronic heart or lung disease, children, and asthmatics as groups most likely to experience adverse health effects with exposure to PM10 and PM 2.5. Also, children and infants are more susceptible to harm from inhaling pollutants such as PM because they inhale more air per pound of body weight than do adults. Children breathe faster, spend more time outdoors, and have smaller body sizes. In addition, their immature immune systems may cause them to be more susceptible to PM than healthy adults. Research in the US has found that children living in communities with high levels of PM 2.5 had slower lung growth and had smaller lungs at age 18 compared to children who lived in communities with low PM 2.5 levels. However, the Indian government denies that studies done elsewhere apply to India. They say Indian lungs are unique. However, the research that is now beginning to come out of India shows even more serious impacts. If a pregnant woman is exposed to air pollution, the chances of fetal distress, stillbirth, and low birth weight go up. If the baby survives, she's more likely to be stunted, which means she's going to be smaller for her age, and wasted way less. This growing child's cognitive development can be delayed and impaired. The child will suffer more acute respiratory infections. It is likely to be anemic. It is more likely to die in infancy. The public health modeling expert I spoke to was careful to point out that every disease is a manifestation of multiple biological and environmental factors. It's hard to separate them, especially when the sources of particulate matter are so hard to pinpoint, and the multiple biological pathways that they travel are so poorly understood. From the air into our lungs, into the blood, into even the brain, what dust does to the body is becoming more evident, but how it does so is barely understood. If it's difficult to identify the sources of air pollution, it is even more difficult to disaggregate the effects of poverty, malnutrition, and air pollution. I've always been a bit puzzled by this drive to parse out these impacts. How much because of poverty? How much because of malnutrition? How much can you attribute to air pollution? It seems such a reductionist exercise. Surely the point is that all of these factors work together, that their sum of human misery is greater than their parts. Should we not understand exposure and vulnerability as the accumulation of disadvantage. Of all the people pictured here, who is already burdened with malnourishment? Who must put their body in harm's way to cook their food, to stay warm, to make a living? Who must deal with dust and live with its deadly toll? Well-to-do people in Delhi are well up on the vocabulary of AQI and PM 2.5. They suffer too, but they have access to safer spaces, sequestered with air conditioners and air purifiers. They have access to the best medical care, and it's now the done thing to travel out of Delhi during Diwali, extending the time-tested strategy of going to hill stations to escape the heat. Or they buy houseplants, the sales of which have shut up during the pandemic because they purportedly purify the air. Elites escape even though their vehicles and their use of power is disproportionately responsible for the crisis that is air pollution. Let me draw to a close with an asthma story. 3 years ago, I was part of a study to find out how adolescents with asthma coped with air pollution and with their illness. To recruit subjects for this study, we went to an East Delhi neighborhood, which was a major center for recycling solid waste. The area was congested and dirty. Heaps of scrap lay out in the open. Small workshops noisily ground plastics into pellets for recycling. A major highway ran alongside. With the help of Chintan, a waste workers NGO that ran an after-school program in the area, we asked a group of children if any of them had difficulty breathing. All of them shook their heads. No. They said, we get out of breath when playing running games, but that's it. No wheezing, nothing. Meanwhile, one of our researchers, who was asthmatic herself, was puffing on her inhaler, unable to cope with the dirty air. The children who lived in the area looked at her pityingly and said, yes, the air is bad, but it doesn't affect us. We've grown up in it. Our bodies are used to it. We were puzzled because that's not how air pollution works. Exposure isn't supposed to give you immunity. It's supposed to make you ill. When we visited a child's home, his mother said to us, there's nothing wrong with my son. He gets colds and coughs now and then, but I am the one you should take to the hospital. She told us she suffered from chest pains and she hadn't seen a doctor. Why? Well, if I went to the government hospital, I'd have to take a day off work and I wouldn't earn that day. And if I went to a private clinic in the neighborhood, the doctor would ask me for x-rays and blood tests, and I don't have money to pay for those, or even money for the fees and the medicines. So she and others in her circumstances would only seek medical help if they were desperate, if their illness stopped them from working, from putting one foot in front of another to earn a living or to run a household. Since we couldn't find any children with asthmatic symptoms in the community, we then went to a big government-run children's hospital that served the area. They had an asthma clinic, and the doctors were willing to let us approach the patients who came once a week to be tested and to get refills on their inhalers. Here, finally, were the asthmatic adolescents we've been searching for. However, our study was designed to include an equal number of boys and girls in the sample. At the hospital, waiting for their turn, we found only boys. So where were the girls? The doctor said parents don't bring girls. So what happens to the girls? How do they cope with asthma? An uncomfortable silence followed. Later, piecing things together, we figured out that little girls with asthma don't get treated. Their parents don't or can't spend the money or the time in dealing with a chronic condition. So they just die early, quietly. But boys are different. Boys are worth looking after, going to hospital, spending money, because boys will earn, boys will look after you when you're old. Those are the choices that poverty, malnutrition, and air pollution dictate together, not independently. A side note, most working class people we spoke to attributed respiratory illness not to pollution, not what is called hawa pani or water and air, but to the declining quality of food. This is something I discussed in my previous lecture as well. People said nowadays they use too many chemicals. The word is used of dawai or medicines. They use too much dawai to grow food these days. Desi or indigenous, desi organic food would clean the blood. Nothing is pure anymore. That is why we have lost our immunity. The poet, translator, writer A.K. Ramanujan interprets a verse from the Taittiriya Upanishad, which is a 6th century BC Vedic text, which runs like this. Food is Brahman because food is what circulates in the universe through bodies which in turn are food made flesh and bone. Food is Brahman because food is what circulates in the universe through bodies which in turn are food made flesh and bone. According to this view, in the organic world, there is no other stuff. Food is a primal substance. All animate beings are its forms. One may, Ramanujan says, stretch it further and see the cycle as embracing inorganic matter as well. All forms arise out of food and return to it. Inorganic becomes organic. The eater is eaten. Big fish eat little fish. And if you wait long enough, little fish eat big fish. Or, as the Anglican Church's Book of Common Prayer says, when burying their dead, a bit dryly, I think, I quote, we therefore commit this body to the ground, earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. The cycle of life on earth is completed. Think of the circle of life, eating food and being eaten, dust to dust, as urban metabolism, the sum total of the technical and socio-economic processes that occur in cities, resulting in growth, production of energy, and elimination of waste. The idea of urban metabolism has helped illuminate material flows, especially those of solid waste in cities in the global south. Its mountains of discarded plastic, metal, glass, and paper. Value that is extracted, consumed, and thrown away is retrieved, recycled, salvaged, ironically by those social groups that are themselves regarded by others as detritus, the dregs of society, as waste. The idea of urban metabolism draws on what John Bellamy Foster has called metabolic rift. Karl Marx's notion of a growing rupture in the dynamic exchange between laboring humans and the rest of nature, emanating from a capitalist agricultural process and the growing division between town and country, a rupture that takes capitalism towards crisis. In Marx's work, industrial agriculture so depleted the soil that continuing it required extracting bones from graveyards and guano or phosphate from distant colonies as synthetic fertilizers. These global circuits of moving resources are accompanied by moving resources in and by moving waste out. Western Europe solved its acid rain problem, its air pollution problem, by outsourcing polluting manufacturing industries to East and Southeast Asia. Which bodies shall live and breathe clean air? Which bodies shall be allowed to die? Thank you.